Hi, so I'm Sam, and the title of this talk is Understanding Parent-Child Co-Regulation. When does arousal synchrony become arousal contagion? To think about, co-regulation starts from the idea of self-regulation. So self-regulation is defined as the ongoing dynamic and adaptive modulation of internal state, emotion, cognition, or behavior mediated by central and peripheral physiology. So that's our definition from NIG. So that's what we're going to be using today. When we're thinking about what exactly we're regulating, again, there's lots of different things that we can be thinking about. We're looking at the regulation of autonomic arousal, defined in our case from a composite measure. So an average measure of heart rate, respiratory sinus arrhythmia, and movement. There's masses and masses to say about that. Here are some citations. I'm not going to be talking about, why we've made that decision today. Some people think about fractionation, subdivisions within the autonomic nervous system. We're treating it here as a one-dimensional construct. But as I say, get in contact with me if you've got any questions about that. We know that self-regulation is related to lots of different things. It's atypical in lots of different conditions. Again, not going to be talking about that today, references on that in this paper here, but enough to make us think it's a really, really important topic. So what we're talking about today really is the transition from co-regulation to self-regulation. So widely accepted from the classical theories, Bronfenbrenner, Tronick, Kopp, that co-regulation is really important in early life. Infants learn self-regulation by experiencing repeated cycles of co-regulation in caregiving. And over time, they internalize the expectation of the parent's soothing response. And through this, they learn self-regulation. So this is the kind of classic model that we're working within today. And what we're really interested in talking about today is mechanisms of co-regulation, particularly co-regulation going right and co-regulation going wrong. So we know that in other areas of developmental science, we've seen a shift from passive models. Yeah, so that's models that look at a one-way flow of information and kind of into the child. So in educational settings, a one-way flow of information from teacher to student, or from the sender of social signals to the receiver of social signals. And we're looking at a shift away from that towards interactive models of learning that emphasize learning as a bidirectional information exchange, that recognize early social communication is about bidirectional information exchanges between the sender and the receiver of social signals. So we're thinking about that from the point of view of co-regulation. So how is the caregiver affected by arousal co-regulation, rather than just thinking about it from the infant's point of view? And how does arousal co-regulation alter the interrelationship between the infant and the caregiver? Okay, so to do that, we got some funding from the Economic Social Research Council UK. This was done by, done by Celia Smith, Farhan Mirza, and Kylie Claxon. And basically what we did was we designed this equipment. So this is a little bib with a built-in electrocardiogram, a movement sensor, GPS, actigraph, microphone, and camera. And the baby wore that kit at home for a day. And the mum wore some clothes that had the same equipment built into them, also for a day. And we basically got a day in the life snapshot. So this is the baby's arousal level. Remember, that's defined from a composite of their heart rate, their respiratory sinus arrhythmia, and their movement patterns. So we got that continuously during a day from, for example, 10 a.m. to 5 a.m. We also got the adult's arousal defined in the same way. We got all of the infant's vocalizations, which we hand-coded on a scale from 1, which was the most sad, to 9, which is the most positive affect. Someone went through and coded those manually to differentiate them. And then we got everything the baby sees. So we got a lot more information today, we got a lot more information in total, but the information I'm talking about today are these 3 streams of information. Okay. So for practical reasons, we only took the sections of the data when the dyad were at home and the baby was awake. And that was mainly, as I say, for practical reasons. When the baby was out and about, we found that they were strapped in a lot into buggies and prams, which strongly affected their physio data. So we just took the home awake sections for these analyses. So when we look overall at during times of the day when the baby's arousal is high, is the caregiver's arousal also high? Yeah. we found that we didn't find an association. So we used a cross correlation and we found no association between the caregiver and the child arousal levels across the course of the whole day. Okay. But we next asked, are interactions related to specific moments, such as peak arousal moments in the child? Yeah. So to look at this, we put a centile threshold level on the baby's arousal. So this is a centile threshold defined for now at the top 5%. So these were the top 5% most aroused moments of that child at that day. And we looked at how the adult's arousal changed relative to those moments. So we basically cut out all those adult arousal around the moments where the child's arousal first crosses that threshold, and we average them. So like an ERP analysis on brain data. And we found using this that parents do react to peak arousal moments in the child. So this moment 0 is the moment where the child crosses their 95th centile arousal threshold. And when we average the adult arousal data around there, we get a clear peak in the adult arousal relative to that moment. Yeah. So that's suggesting that parents increase their own arousal in response to peak arousal moments in the child. We also did the same analysis looking at how the adult's arousal changes relative to infant negative affect vocalizations and positive affect vocalizations. And here we find the same pattern more strongly for negative affect vocalizations, that the adult increases their arousal relative to infant negative affect vocalizations, and less so for positive affect vocalizations as well. Okay. So remember I said that across the course of the whole day, times when the baby's arousal is high, the parent's arousal isn't also high. Yeah, we did that same analysis, a cross correlation analysis, but instead of looking at the whole day at once, we did the same analysis on a windowed basis. Yeah, so we looked at one section, do we get associations between times when the parent's arousal is high and the baby's arousal is low, and then we move the window, repeated the analysis, and so on. Yeah, and we looked at how this changes relative to infant vocalizations. And here we get a nice clear picture, which is that relative to negative affect vocalization, so that's the times in the day when the baby sounds upset, yeah, around those moments, we do get an increase in parent-child arousal synchrony. Yeah, so this is the cross correlation in parent-child arousal during the course of the day, and you don't relative to positive affect vocalizations. Yeah. So this suggests that parents do react to peak arousal moments in the child. Yeah, and they react in two different ways. In response to an increase in infant arousal, they upregulate their own arousal. So that's increasing their arousal state, potentially to match the arousal state of the child. Yeah. And then we also know that we get short-term increases in parent-child arousal synchrony. So we get these two different types of movement. Yeah. So this is parents responding to an increase in infant arousal by matching their arousal state to their babies. Yeah. So this is interesting, we think, immediately in a couple of ways. Yeah. So firstly, when does co-regulation involve matching your state to empathize, as we're showing here? And when does it involve doing a different type of reaction? Yeah, that I get a lot of when I present this work to things like early years teachers, and we talk about this idea of when I'm with a child who's aroused, do I increase my own arousal to match their state? And they are often quite surprised by this idea. They think very much more in terms of the other way around. Yeah. So when I'm with a child who's particularly aroused, I need to work particularly hard to stay calm. Yeah. To set a positive example to the child. Yeah. So it's this tension between these two things, which both on the face of them sound a good idea. Yeah. On the one hand, I'm matching my state to theirs, which we think may be a mechanism, something to do with empathy. Yeah. And on the other, I'm setting them a good example by staying calm. Yeah. So that's a tricky question. In this analysis, in this current biology paper, we actually include some more analyses looking at that, but I'm not going to be talking to you about those today. But it is a really, really good question. And the other question which I am going to be talking about today is, okay, so we know that parents are matching their arousal states to the baby, and we think, and we know we've got some evidence that this is driving short-term increases in parent-child arousal synchrony. So is this always a good thing? Is arousal state matching always a good thing? So that's what we went to look at in the second half of the talk today. And this is looking at co-regulation going wrong. So this work was led by Celia Smith with Emily Jones and Tony Charman. And as part of this, we looked at how this matching process differs between anxious and non-anxious parents. So this was a community sample. So this was actually based on the same data as the previous analyses, but we subdivided our sample using the GAD-7 questionnaire, which is a common clinical screener for anxiety symptoms. As I say, this wasn't a clinical sample, though. This was just a regular, convenient sample of parents who volunteered from our database. Yeah. So we're looking at variability and anxiety within a typical data set. Yeah. Remember that across all data, we'd found no association between the parents and child's arousal. Yeah. But when you split this by parent anxiety, you do get an association in the highly anxious group. Yeah. So the blue lines here, the high GAD-7 group, are the high anxiety mums. And there you do get an association, but you don't in the low GAD-7 mums. Yeah. So you get stronger associations between the child's and the parent's arousal levels during the day in the high anxiety parents. Okay, so more synchrony in the high anxiety parents. So to understand this more, we repeated the same analysis that I was just telling you about. Yeah. So we looked at so first of all, we looked, just as I looked in the previous paper, at how the parent's arousal changes relative to the moments where the child's arousal crosses the 95th arousal centile. Yeah. So here, so remember I showed that overall you get a peak in parent arousal relative to those moments. When you subdivide this peak by high, low parent anxiety, it looks pretty similar. Yeah. So this suggests that our anxious and our less anxious parents are reacting similarly when their babies cross the 95th arousal centile. So that's their top 5% most high aroused moments of arousal that day. Yeah. But when you reduce this threshold, yeah, and you repeat this analysis, you get this really interesting picture, yeah, which is when you get to these lower centile threshold arousal levels. So these are babies' times when the baby crosses its top 25% most high arousal levels during the day. Yeah. When you lower this threshold to that level, you're not getting a spike in the low anxiety mums anymore. Yeah. So the low anxiety mums are selectively responding only when their baby really has a peak arousal crisis moment. Yeah. But the high anxiety mums are responding even to the lower, less kind of crisis moments from the baby. Yeah. And that's what we think drives this finding that overall you get more arousal synchrony during the course of the day in highly anxious parents. Okay. So highly anxious parents are more likely to overreact to small fluctuations, yeah, in child arousal, which we think drives increased synchrony. Okay. And next, building on this, we went to look at what's the role of parent-child vocal communication in co-regulation. And here we looked at the associations between the caregiver arousal and the caregiver vocalizations. Yeah. And again, these were hand-coded on a scale from high to low intensity and positive to negative affect. Okay. So first, we looked at the association between parent caregiver arousal, yeah, and how likely they were to be vocalizing to their child at the time of their peak in arousal, yeah, using a similar analysis to the one that I was telling you about earlier. Yeah, and there's more detail to be talking about with this, but I haven't got time now. If you're interested, look up the paper or ask me in detail. Yeah, but the take home was that anxious caregivers are more likely to vocalize to their child around peaks in their own arousal. So when I have a peak in my arousal, if I'm an anxious caregiver, I'm more likely to vocalize to my child at that time. We also looked at how the temporal patterning of these vocalizations, yeah, and we looked at how they co-occur in time, yeah, and we find that in highly anxious parents, if you get one type of these high intensity vocalizations, you're more likely to get other similar vocalizations co-occurring in time, yeah, whereas in low anxiety parents, you're less likely to get that. Finally, we looked at how the baby's arousal changes relative to these parental vocalizations. And we found that in a high anxiety group, we're getting more sustained increases in infant arousal, yeah, around these vocalizations. So these are three things that we're saying are interrelated, yeah. Firstly, we're saying that when more anxious parents are highly aroused, they're more likely to vocalize to their child. Yeah. Secondly, we're saying that these vocalizations are more likely to occur in clusters. Yeah. Thirdly, we're saying that these vocalizations are more likely to associate with sustained increases in arousal in the child. Yeah. Okay. So coming back to these kind of one directional versus two directional arrows that I started with. Yeah. So here, so the traditional models of arousal co-regulation are framed from the point of view of an increase in infant arousal causes the caregiver to step in, which causes a decrease in infant arousal. Yeah. And here we're talking about something that's quite different to this. Yeah. We're talking about dysregulatory dynamics, and we're talking about a different type of dynamical dysregulation. Yeah. So an increase in caregiver arousal causes the caregiver to interact differently with a child. Yeah. In our case, they're more likely to vocalize to them. Yeah. Which causes an increase in infant arousal. Yeah. And I haven't shown it here, but in this paper from Development in Psychopathology, we can be talking about this in more detail, how that causes in turn the infant to interact differently with a caregiver, which then causes an increase in caregiver arousal. Yeah. So we get this kind of vicious circle type behavior. Yeah. One thing causes another, which causes another, and then you get this self-sustaining cycle. Yeah. In theory, you could start anywhere on the cycle. Yeah. The example I've given starts from an increase in caregiver arousal, but equally you could start with an increase in infant arousal or something exogenous. Yeah. But the key is these are bidirectional dysregulatory dynamics. Yeah, that's the difference. We're not talking about a one-way flow. We're talking about a bidirectional dysregulatory dynamic. Okay. So just to say what I've said, arousal state matching across a caregiver-child dyad can be a good thing, we think. We know that in typical development, caregivers respond to an increase in infant arousal by matching their own arousal state to their babies. But we also think that it's possible that caregivers can be temporarily overmatched. Yeah, that there's an intermediate level of matching, which is good, and that overmatching can be bad, just like undermatching. Yeah, we think that the best pattern may be an intermediate level of contingency, so that I'm there when you need me, but only when you need me. Yeah, and we think that that is the moment where parent-child arousal synchrony turns into potentially parent-child arousal contagion. Just to say very quickly, the 3 papers that I've been talking about in this talk are here, the references if you want to look them up. But thank you very much to funders, to colleagues, to members of the lab, and of course, most importantly, to our participants.